Best Hate Show Money Can Buy is the 7th episode of the 6th season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by James Widdoes, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. I don't actually have a tremendous amount to say. It is not the most interesting episode. The ending definitely is, and I'll talk about that when we get there. But I feel like they could have just wrapped this up in the previous episode. I really don't think it needed to be this long. Maybe that was enough for another 10 minutes or so, but for a full episode, it was a little bit repetitive. For example, well, I'll talk about that when we get there, but there's a scene with Judith, and it just seemed really boring and pointless, but I'll talk about that when we get there. It starts off establishing that we're basically picking up where we left off. Alan doesn't feel great that he slept with Judith, but Charlie says he had the perfect night of revenge sex, and we do have a great conversation where Alan and Charlie don't want Jake to know what they're talking about, so they keep switching it up when Jake comes in the room, and Alan ends up talking about Warner Brothers characters, Looney Tunes characters, and then Charlie ends up doing the same, and then Berta comes in and they start using code, and Jake thinks he's going to military school, and throughout the episode, Charlie is taking advantage of that by making Jake do things around the house to not go to military school, which is a bit cruel, but Jake was genuinely scared, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Judith then calls Alan, and he goes over, and this is the scene that I think probably didn't really need to be there, because they're having dinner, and she's still all over him, and later on, he goes back to her again, and Herb is busy showing some women his train sets, and Charlie's with him, and I liked Herb's suit. Herb looked pretty good. And Judith is apologising to Alan and saying he's right about things, and it's not the usual Judith, but pretty quickly she goes back to the usual Judith and picks faults with everything he says. And I feel like that scene would have been enough. I don't think we needed the previous scene where she was serving him the biggest glass of wine I've ever seen. It just felt like it didn't really add anything. Nothing that could have been added the second time he goes back to Judith. So it definitely feels like they were trying to pad it out to give it 2 episodes. Also, Herb and Charlie going out and picking up the women, that just didn't really add anything either. So it feels like maybe they had too much material for 1 episode, but in my opinion, not enough for 2 episodes. And if those scenes had been funny, then fair enough, but I didn't think they were particularly funny. They were okay, but they weren't that amazing. We learned that Judith was actually just afraid of being alone at 40. That's why she was all over Alan, because being with Alan in the moment was a better option than being alone. And Charlie and Alan are then on the deck again, and we have some jokes about cabooses, and then it cuts to 6 weeks later, and this is the bit that I like. This is probably the only bit that I think was decent. Well, the whole conversation with the Looney Tunes characters and the military school and things, I liked that. So I liked the beginning, and I liked the end. Everything in the middle just felt like fluff, padding, apart from the scene where Judith admitted why she was doing it. I think that was definitely relevant. And at the end, 6 weeks later, it took Jake 6 weeks, which makes me think, has Charlie been taking advantage of Jake for 6 weeks because he comes in and says his grades aren't good enough for military school? So have they been playing this for 6 weeks? Maybe. I wouldn't put it past Charlie. And they also reveal that Judith and Herb are going to have a baby. And of course, Alan begins to panic because it could be his. And we end the episode on a cliffhanger. And honestly, it's pretty dramatic and I like it. And I feel like the episode maybe was worth it to get to that point, but I feel like they absolutely could have just put that in the previous episode. I think they could have made room for it in the previous episode, but it's not a horrendous episode. I don't hate it, but honestly, I don't know if I probably would watch it if I'm binge watching this season. I probably wouldn't skip it, but it's not the funniest. The beginning's funny, the ending's dramatic, the middle's not that great, but it's fine. So it's not the strongest episode, but nevertheless, I feel like the Best Hate Show Money Can Buy, or Best Hate Show Money Can Buy, is still a good episode. It has some really strong moments. They're few and far between, but nevertheless, I enjoyed it for the most part, and I'm looking forward to watching the next one.